Chapter 15, we're going to start learning about object-oriented programming in Python. So the first thing we need to do is learn how to declare a class and an object. And they're very similar things, but we're going to see the difference here. So the simplest class that you can define looks like this. First, you use the keyword class that tells Python that you're going to be building a class. Give it a name. Put some parentheses here, followed by colon. It's possible to pass in parameters, but we're not going to be doing that in this case because we're doing the simplest form of a class we can. You can create comments if you want to. Comments for classes are a little bit odd in that it's 3 sets of double quotes. And then inside the class, the simplest version is we're not going to do anything, so I'm just going to issue a pass command. So this is a class. Now think of a class as, think about like if you're building a house, then a class is like a set of plans that you would get from an architect. So it's not actually a house, it's just an outline for what a house should look like and how a house should behave. When we come down here and create an object of type class, that's called instantiation. So we are instantiating the class and making an object. Now we actually have a physical house, and the house looks like the plans. Now in our case, our plans don't have a whole lot in it, but we can add to the plans. So I'm going to declare object1, which is, again, of type class simple, to have in it a variable x, and I'm going to assign it to 5. So now what Python does, and notice we haven't declared x up here anywhere in our outline for what simple should look like. So what Python does is it says, okay, you want object1.x. So we're using this dot notation, which is a notation that you use for objects. And what that means is I have an object called object1, and I want to reference the variable x inside of that object. So Python will go up and look at the class and say, okay, so has x been used up here at all previously for object? And the answer is no. So it's okay, well, so apparently they want a variable x, and we're just going to declare that to be 5. So I can print out object.x. I can add 1 to it, so I can treat it like any other integer. I could, create strings for this object and other things like that. Let's go ahead and run this, and we'll see that when we print object.x, we get 5, and then we add 1 to object.x and print it again, and we get 6. Now, at this point, it doesn't really seem very useful to have this class or this object when we're just dealing with integers. So one of the ways to think about an object is that an object isn't just a piece of information like an integer that we've set equal to 5. An object tells us, or has information, but it also tells us how to operate with that information. And we've seen objects in Python before. In fact, everything in Python is treated as an object. So, for example, you have integers is a type in Python that you can add, you can subtract. So you have operations that you can do with those integers. And so that makes integers a type of object. It's not just information, it's information plus operations that you can do with that information packaged together into one piece. Okay, so we're going to go and look at a different topic, declaring instance variables. So it's possible that I can declare a variable inside my class. So I have a new class, doesn't do much, and I'm declaring a variable count instances, and I'm declaring that to be 5. So this is an attribute for the object, count instances. And then I'm going to instantiate a version of doesn't do much. So I'm actually creating now an object of type class. So it's going to Python will set aside some memory for us and store object in there. And I'm going to print out. Now, here's the difference. Count instances can be treated as a class variable where I actually use the class name doesn't do much .count instances, and it also can be used as what's known as an instance variable, object1.count instances. And we're going to see what the difference is here in a second. So down here, I'm going to add 1 to the object1.count instances. Or I'm not sorry, add 1. I'm going to add 3 to it. And I'm going to reprint then the class variable and the instance variable. And what we're going to find out is these two things are actually different. And the reason for that is when Python, well, it's a little bit tricky, but in this case, because we're using integers, which are immutable, when Python sees this, the count instances add 3 to it, it's actually going to create a new version of that count instances variable for just the object1, not for the entire class. Okay, so now when we've done this, object1.count instances become sort of local to just this version of the object, and the class variable is left alone, and we won't be adding 3 to that. So to prove that, or to check that, I'm going to create another instance of doesn't do much. So I'm going to instantiate doesn't do much again as object2, and I'm going to print out the count instances for those 3 things. So I'm going to print out the class variable and instance variable 1 and instance variable 2. And then I'm going to add 1 to the class variable. Doesn't do much, and we will see what happens with class variable, instance variable 1, and instance variable 2. All right, so I'm kind of scroll up here. So initially, when we instantiate object 1, then doesn't do much to count instances. The class variable and the instance variable 1 are the same. So we print those out, we can get both of those are 5. Then I add 3 to object1.count instances. Because it's immutable, it creates a new version, and it's local to just object1. So now we see that the class variable and instance variable are different. Then we create object2 and print out the class variable, instance variable, and instance variable 2. And we see that object2 has the same value as the class variable, but instance variable 1 is still 8. Finally, we are going to add 1. I should have put a new line in here in the print, but I didn't. So we're going to add 1. Add 1 right here. That's that print right there. We're going to add 1 to the class variable. And notice that that does not affect the instance variable 1 because that's now a new variable. But this variable, instance variable 2, actually is an alias for the class variable, and so those two actually are the same. So the gist of all this is, if you're going to use a class variable, you better be really darn careful about how you use it, because it's pretty easy to change it in one place and cause effects in other places that you really hadn't anticipated. Now, there's another thing here that this really, and we're going to get into this as we learn more object-oriented programming, but this kind of activity right here is really something I should not be doing. So if you are an expert in object-oriented programming, your hair should be standing up on the back of your neck, because what I've done is I have accessed an attribute for the object directly and added 3 to it. Really, what should happen is the object should have a built-in functionality to change count instances where I'm not accessing it directly. And that actually should be built up to protect us from making, well, mistakes or possible mistakes where we're setting up one instance variable to be different from the class variable. But the idea here is that objects should be completely transparent to the user. They should have data, and they should have objects for acting on that data, but we shouldn't be acting on that data directly. Now, things get even worse when you have a mutable type that you've declared as a class variable. So in this case, I've got the same class, doesn't do much. Well, it's not the same class, it's the same name. And I'm going to use a class variable that is now a list. So that's mutable. And the code here is pretty similar to what I have before. I declare or instantiate that class doesn't do much as object1. So now I have an instance of doesn't do much. Print out doesn't do much dot mutable, object1 dot mutable. And then I'm going to append to object1. So object1 dot mutable is a list. I can append to it 2. And I'm going to print out doesn't do much dot mutable, object1 dot mutable. And then we're going to create a new instance of doesn't do much as object2. And we'll print those 3 out, and we'll see what happens here. And what we find is initially these two lists, the class variable and the instance variable, both have just the number 1 in it. But then when I append 2 to object1.mutable, suddenly both the class variable and instance variable are the same list. So when I append 2 to this, because the list is mutable, it's not going to create a new list. It's actually going to use the same list as the class variable. And then you can see down below when I create a new instance of this class doesn't do much, then it also has the same list 1, 2. Okay, so a few things to keep in mind for this video. First of all, to declare a class, it's a simple command, class doesn't do much. Actually, in this case, I don't have parentheses here, but that's okay. That'll work. Followed by a colon, must have that colon there, or Python will yell. You can put in comments if you want. You can have class variables and instance variables, but again, be careful how you use those. And then you can instantiate an object by just setting an equal to your class declaration with this. In this case, you do need parentheses here. So we're going to go on and start building up some ways of using classes, but it is admittedly going to take us a little while to get a full handle on how classes and objects and works in Python. So be patient.